Well, first off, thank you so much for having us. It's a thrill to be talking to Michael. For people that might be wondering, Michael and I used to be neighbors, and I'll start with telling you all how we met. My life was completely falling apart, and I had nowhere to go, and I moved into the Chelsea Hotel with two little kids, and an unbelievable thing happened shortly after we moved in. My daughter had been playing in the hallway and stuff, and this beautiful note got slipped under our front door, and it had a picture of Nicolaya, who was Michael's daughter, and it said, like, my name is Nicolaya. What is your name? And my daughter wrote back, and so they kind of became friends, and then, believe it or not, then I met Michael and Sheila, who are two of the most amazing. Michael's wife is a wonderful artist, and they're both some of the most amazing thinkers. And I started reading Michael's writing, and it's a really honor to know you, Michael. And it's irritating that it's taken you so long to write another book since Naked Lady.
Right.
But I want to start off by saying that when I saw the title, The Golden Flea, these memories flash back of you going to those flea markets and telling me about the flea markets. And it seemed an odd, eccentric, I don't know, like a weird hat somebody might wear sometimes, where it didn't seem to have a lot of connection to the rest of your life. But it always kind of surprised me that the passion and joy with which, and patience that you had with that. But I still didn't think it was very interesting, not interesting enough to make a book about. And Michael, I was so moved by your memoir because I didn't realize it, but there's something about those flea markets that gets at the essence of what we're doing here and how we're connected to the past, and what is it that we value, and what monetary tag do you put on that? What's worth finding? And is it really your own judgment, or what role does society's judgment play on the value of something?
Right.
And when society scorns it, there's an amazing moment in the memoir when you're kind of wondering out loud with I forget whether it was the prophet or whoever, about what's the famous book about mental disorders that he has memorized?
Yes.
And
the
manual. You're talking about
yeah.
hoarding.
Right.
Yeah, and he kind of defines hoarding for you, and what it means, and collecting things that other people feel has no value, which is something that I feel all people in the arts. It's actors are always trying to give voice to the voiceless, right? The great, whether you're a contemporary playwright or what Shakespeare did is he found the voice. Whether you're Joan Didion, you're giving voice to a voice that hasn't been expressed before. Emily Dickinson, and that's what art is. And I have to say that I'll stop in a second talking at you, and I will ask some questions. But the combination of living through this quarantine here in New York and reading this book right now, there's passages in the book where every time you find something, whether it's a painting or a bead or one of the strange things that people collect, it's always set in its time period. Oh, World War I soldiers used to use these beads to,
Right.
blah, blah. And I had this thought of like, well, someday will people collect art that bus drivers made during the quarantine?
Right.
And how this book seems so connected.
Yes.
Well, it's connected to the past, clearly, and the past connects to the present moment.
Right.
And this is the final point I'll make. One of the first things a lot of us did when we were quarantining, if you're lucky enough to have a closet that needs reorganizing or a basement, I have a basement, right? And I got, I'm looking at 50 years old now, and I've been professionally acting since I was 17, even earlier.
Oh, yeah.
I've collected a lot of crap, from my life. it's strange. I almost started going through it like a dead person, you know, like how I imagined after my funeral my kids would, or something like. And they don't know the difference between the picture of Danielle and the picture of Lynn, or why that one trip to Coney Island was so important to me. And
right.
And they'll all just go in the same garbage heap, right? But then I read your book, and because I'd had a kind of existential crisis cleaning out my closet, as one does, and your book made it make sense. What do you think about what I'm saying at you?
I couldn't agree more with you. The book is about the flea market as an avatar, as an oasis of uncertainty. Uncertainty lives within us, and it lives outside of us, and it is something that we have become frightened by, and we avoid, and as a result, we've become imbalanced. And psychiatrists talk about us becoming late 20th century, early 21st century people becoming fearful of uncertainty. And then when we have crises in our lives, when uncertainty enfolds us, we have a terrible time dealing with it. And even when we're not in crises, by suppressing uncertainty, as Nietzsche said, we suppress the star which is within us. And when you and I met, we were both in very uncertain times in our lives, and we told stories, and that was a way of dealing with uncertainty, addressing uncertainty. Your buddy Tom Stoppard in Arcadia and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern deals with this topic. And I ended up getting into things that the book never addresses. So there was, for example, the Bible. The Bible begins with God, but God does not create the world out of nothingness. That's a later retranslation of the Bible. The Bible literally says there is God and there is chaos. And God dips into part of the chaos to create the world. So there is this coexisting, if not preceding, uncertainty, vast uncertainty, this chaos that even God has to deal with. And he uses part of it to create the earth, but he leaves the rest of it. And it's in that uncertainty that I see inspiration. And it's why the surrealists like Breton used to go to the flea market all the time, and they would find all sorts of inspiration because it was a dreamscape. The juxtaposition of people, unusual people, the juxtaposition of unusual objects, allowed them to transcend logic and rationality and reach some more profound truth. So that's really that's the theme of the book.
Well, you know, I'm so moved that you say that, because the first thing, it's late in the book, and I had to stop and get my pen, and I underlined what you wrote about uncertainty and how much that spoke to me at this moment. I think this is, all of us are feeling that way. I remember one of the things that last year I did this movie, First Reformed, or it came out last year, and it was a really interesting experience working with Paul Schrader.
I love that movie.
He's so well, thanks. But you know, he's such a fine writer, and he's such a serious filmmaker. And you know, one of the funny things when you work with people as an actor, sometimes you don't get to know them at all, but you get to know them better when you do Q&As and publicity events. Because when you're both like working, I was just worried about my own performance, and he's worried about his shots. And we don't sit there and talk about theory. You know, I didn't talk about theory with him until we were publicizing it. And one of the things that he spoke about was that contemporary movies do too much work for the audience. They play the music at a certain moment. The camera pans in on the eye just as the tear drops. And you don't have to think for yourself at all.
Right.
And one of the things that great art does is invite you to be a participant. You know, when you look at a Jackson Pollock painting or something, your first thought is, well, a kid could do that, right? Everybody sits and goes, but then you kind of get hypnotized by it. And kind of like what you talked about, I mean, you can call it God or you can call it love. There's this part of us that wants to make sense out of the chaos.
Right.
And we're always doing it. No sooner do you stare at a Jackson Pollock painting than your brain starts to say, oh, I see a connection between the blues paints and the gray ones. Oh, he's painting the electric wire works of my brain. This is a self-portrait. You know, your brain starts to make sense out of it. And I remember going to that Chelsea flea market, and you could lose 4 hours in a trunk.
Right.
You know, I mean, time could just evaporate. You know, and you know what? I remember I'm a geek for old movie posters. You know, and every now and then you just find a gem of an old movie poster. But the hunt and why, and then it forces you to ask, why do I think old movie posters are great? Because I want the movies I make to matter and age. Right. And if I say that this movie that was shot 70 years ago by Tyrone Power and a couple of, if I say that that's important, then maybe somebody 70 years from now will think, my last, you know, I mean, I think it's not rocket science. It's a pretty clear geometry to what's happening in your memoir.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a philosopher named whom I love, Emmanuel Levinas, and Levinas said, we live with uncertainty. We don't know anything about the people, strangers who are passing on the street. He said, and that's also true of the person who's lying next to us in the bed. What do we really know? How deep is our understanding of that person? And he said, if you think about that, then the question is, well, then if you don't really know the person you're sleeping with, how do you know God? Right? And if you tell people you know God, you don't really know God. You know something that's your creation. And he said, once you relax with that idea, and by the way, wonderfully, he says, you know what? God is probably so enormous that God doesn't comprehend himself. And he said, once you relax with that idea, you can appreciate the beauty and the confusion about you. And I love that idea. And I'm always disappointed when you meet people who are doing exactly what you said. They're trying to impose a narrative on you. They're trying to get up close and explaining every little line, every little detail of a painting, of a person, of a character. And I was going to ask you, you know, John Brown, for example. Often the discussion of John Brown is black or white. Was he sane or was he insane? And it never seems to allow for the complexity of that character.
Well, what you're talking about is, I think,
tell the audience
the biggest trap of being in a. What's that?
Tell the audience what we're talking about, because it's a.
Well, what we're talking about is I just finished playing the abolitionist John Brown. James McBride wrote an incredible book called The Good Lord Bird a couple of years ago. He's got a new book out right now called Deacon King Kong, which is equally fabulous. But The Good Lord Bird took my breath away because, you know, we're all living in the same America where, you know, everybody keeps tripping over race and our inability to see beyond it, and our inability as a nation, you know, and the police violence that's happening all the time, and the inequality in the class system, and, you know, I mean, it's just like this country is founded on a great sin, but it's so hard to look at because so many people feel so guilty, or I don't know why it's so hard for people to look at. I frankly I've never understood that. But McBride does it with so much wit and so much love. And it's not a right-wing look, and it's not a left-wing look, and it's not, he tells the story of John Brown through the eyes of a cross-dressing 14-year-old boy who's riding with John Brown all the way to Harper's Ferry raid. All right. And the kid doesn't want to be there, and he just wants to eat a good solid dinner, and it's absolutely hysterical. But the genius of the book lies, for me, in kind of what you're saying, which is dualistic thinking. And if I could define the biggest shift for me that has happened through the process of getting older, is more and more you stop thinking dualistically. Like it's either good or it's bad. My wife is a saint. My wife is the bane of my existence. My kids are angels. If I just didn't have my kids, I mean, everything is so much deeper than that.
Right.
And, guys like Trump and our present political system is, there's a great Simone Weil essay called something like "Why I Don't Belong to Any Political Party." Right. And when I read it, I just loved it, because the second you say you belong to a party, you just announced to everybody who's not in your party that you're against them, and you haven't even talked about one idea.
Right. This binary
thing with John Brown. Yeah. And it's and that's what's brilliant about the flea market too. The de Kooning painting sold for $1 million too. So spending your life at a flea market is worth it. Oh, it's a fraud. You wasted your time. And that's and people. I remember one of my kids, Clementine, had to write an essay on whether John Brown was sane or insane.
Right.
And it was when it was just a coincidence, but I was already preparing for the part. And she said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, what do you think is the definition of a country? Is a country sane or insane if it buys and sells children? And if it cages children and sells them, if it treats women, it's basically a sex trade, do you think the buying and selling of human beings is sane or insane?"
Right.
I'm like, well, so the question, it's like, so if he's being either sane with an insane culture, or an insane culture is, you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, we get into that.
And the point is, it's so much deeper than that. John Brown understood that. I mean, he saw it in this really complex way, that he felt that there'd been a sin against God, and that for every child stolen from Africa, there would be a child taken from the North and the South. Right. He thought the North and the South were equally to blame. And the Civil War to him was, it was an inevitable, what he said, there'll be crying and lamentations from every home, North and South. God will equalize the pain, and the white people of this country will pay for their crime. God is going to work it out. He saw Gettysburg coming, and the blood in Gettysburg and all those battles is of a biblical proportion, Yeah.
I met in the flea market a fellow whom, when I first met him, he was old. He had a limp. He was very, very sweet man, very thin, very quiet. And he collected, as you referred to, these little buttons. And that was his thing. And so I interpret him as this sort of grandfatherly, gentle presence. His name is Ben. He was gentle. So I'm sitting with another person, another picker in the flea market. And he said, "Oh, I saw you with Ben." And I said, yeah, he's a friend of mine. He said, don't hang out with Ben. I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, he's a murderer. He's a terrible, evil person who murders people." Right? He's an old guy with a limp who collects little women's buttons off of 19th century garments. And so I say to Ben one day, we're having tea somewhere, and I say, "Ben, there's this rumor about that you're a murderer." He said, "Well, yeah, kind of true, And he explains the fact that he was grew up in Little San Juan, which is the neighborhood up on the Upper West Side, is a heroin addict as a kid, gets into jazz, is a friend of Miles Davis's as a kid, and ends up going to prison. In prison, he's introduced to art. He gets out of prison and he creates in his 20s this radical political art group called the Black Mass. And he's publishing a newspaper and also going out and protesting. And some of the protests got quite violent against racist groups up and down the East Coast. And, you know, some people are hurt, some people are killed. And he takes in this homeless woman, young girl, and he takes her in. She turns out to be, in his view, brilliant. And she starts writing this journal for him called The Black Mask. She renames it. And one day she's sitting there writing with him, and she looks up and she says to him, Ben, who's the most offensive artist, the most, you know, sort of capitalistic artist that anybody knows? And Ben says, well, Andy Warhol. And she said, exactly who I was thinking of. And she goes off to lunch, right? Next thing Ben knows, he gets a call. This young lady has shot Andy Warhol, right? It was Valerie Solanas. And so Ben goes, Valerie shot Andy Warhol? And he can't believe it until he gets another phone call from a friend of his who says, Ben, get the hell out of there, right? Ben gets in his car because his friend says the FBI are looking for you. He drives across country, doesn't stop till he gets to Colorado, drives up into the mountains of Colorado. When his car can't go any farther, gets out, he starts walking until he gets to an Indian reservation. He ends up living with the Indians, the Native American tribe, for 40 years, right? He lives with this tribe for 40 years. And then he comes finally, as an old man, basically, he comes back to the East Coast. He comes to the flea market because it's the one place where he feels safe. And he starts to collect buttons. And Valerie Solanas, if you can find her publication with Ben called, and she renamed it Up Against the Wall Motherfucker, very valuable. And then you go to the flea market and there is Ben, as you were saying. Is he good? Is he evil? Is he an old man? Is he, you know, a young murderer? He's a complex human being. And we're all complex human beings. And that's what I love about these characters in the flea market.
Well, and you know,
you're
absolutely,
my friend.
Well, you know, it's what's so funny about people, all of us. People often will say to me, "Oh, you worked with this famous person or this famous actress, and what was she like?" And they're like, "Was he crazy?" And you're like, "Oh, yeah, he was crazy, but he seems so talented." "Oh, he's ridiculously talented." I heard he was really mean. Sometimes he's really mean, but you said he was really nice. "Oh, he was really nice to me." You know, it's like people want it to be one thing. It's like that great. Do you remember that Saturday Night Live skit? You know, did he kill Gumby? Well, he was the nicest guy I ever met. You know, he was always took his grandmother out to eat, and he always helped poor people. So he do you think he killed Gumby? Oh, definitely. It's all he ever talked about. I mean, you
got to move back into the goddamn Chelsea Hotel so we can sit with a bottle of bourbon and, you know, talk and tell stories.
You know, the Chelsea Hotel is its own flea market, really. You know, I mean, it's no coincidence that the Chelsea is a strange. It's holding on to the past too.
Yeah.
You know, and often holding on to the past is seen sometimes. I mean, I wanted to tell you this quote when I thought of this great. You know, there's Willie Nelson is very famous for his old guitar called Trigger. You know, and it's beat up and it's got all his carvings on it and stuff like that. And I asked him once about the guitar because it's some event he wasn't playing it. And I said, wait, where's Trigger? He goes, the truth is, I'm paraphrasing for all you Willie fans out there. This may not be exact, but it's the way I remember it. He said, the funny thing is when I was younger, I really liked old guitars because they had character. And now I have character and I really like new guitars. And it's really this whole ebb and flow of where the past meets with the present and the future. One of the things that I think we both loved about the Chelsea in our time when we were first meeting was having young kids in this old building. There was something magical about, because in Nikolaya and Maya is the future, right? It's just God willing, they'll see beyond us, and what will the next generation make out of the Chelsea Hotel? It's kind of not a nice thing to say about yourself or to repeat or something. Sometimes I've actually come across this more than once, and it doesn't hurt my feelings at all. I find it kind of interesting, but when the Chelsea was in decline right before it closed down and reopened, there was a bunch of articles about the heyday of the Chelsea Hotel and Kerouac and Burroughs, Patti Smith, and all these great artists were there. And now all it's got is Ethan Hawke. And I was like, hey guys, why are you gonna use the hotel to take a shot at me? Not everybody else is being compared. Compare anybody to the people you just mentioned, they're gonna come up short. You know what I mean? Why do I gotta be better than the greatest of all time? And yet at the same time, and this is my ego talking, it's like, you go, well, you know what? There's probably 15 people living at the Chelsea right now that you haven't even heard of, and their names will be famous 70 years from now.
Absolutely.
And you guys are so out to lunch with what's actually happening that I'll bet you when Kerouac was here, you'd make fun of him. So
absolutely. Fuck them. You know what? That's right.
But it is.
I'm an executive director of the Art Students League, and I meet instructors there every day who are extraordinary. And I know that in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, suddenly it's going to be the heyday. 2020 was the great time of the Art Students League when Frank O'Kane was there, Ron Landfield and Sharon Sprung and all of these, and Naomi Campbell, John Veriano, et cetera, were all there, and Costa was there. And right now, these people are appreciated, but in no way as appreciated as they should be. It just, it takes time.
Well, let's face it, the same could be said for, almost everybody on the planet doesn't get the appreciation we all deserve and need. And I think that one of the things that I think causes us the most pain is something, I think why that word uncertainty leapt out of your memoir at me is we all love this narrative, and our brains do it right away. We give people a hierarchy. I place Emily Dickinson here, and Bob Dylan is there, and this person, and we do it, and we do it to famous people, and we do it to our friends. My brother, I give a B+. My sister's a C-. And we attach a status onto everything as if there's some sense that we can make out of the universe. I really think we do this. I've watched it happen with the movie industry. Here's a better example of this. When I was a kid, I had no idea whether One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest made any money, right? I had no idea what it, I just knew it was a great movie or whatever. And then slowly, okay, well, that slowly, Jaws and Star Wars and all this stuff, and people start writing about how much money movies make. They didn't used to write about that at all. And then it became like a big game. And then they started publishing it, not just in Variety. They would publish it in the New York Times and USA Today. What was the number one grossing movie of the weekend? They basically turned what was an art form into a business competition.
Absolutely.
I guess. And wait, and let me get to this. And then strangely, they've even done the same thing with reviews now. I can go online and say, okay, The Joker came out this weekend. Oh, it's got this rating on Rotten Tomatoes, right? And this movie's only got, and sometimes I'll find myself watching a movie and I'll go, God, I love that movie. And then I'll see that it got like 22% on Rotten Tomatoes or something.
Right.
And I imagine what we've turned everything into this thing that we can be certain about. It's good or bad.
Right. Yeah. And there's,
you know what I mean? And it,
there's this steep,
that's okay. Go on. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
Yeah, I agree. There's this steep hierarchy, often dictated by how much money something makes. And part of the book is that the lowliest people on that hierarchy in the public's mind are these poor vendors at the flea market. They're seen as grifters, poor people, uneducated people who, ferret through Goodwills and thrift shops and yard sales on the East Coast, and they come and they offer their trinkets in parking lots on the weekend. And what I wanted to say is these people who everybody considers at the bottom of the hierarchy are exalted. There's something so magical and interesting about these people that there is nothing lowly in the world, right? That one should appreciate that these people are exalted and transcendent in their own way, and that really gets to the heart of the book and my affection for the flea market.
Tell us about the one behind you. It's one of the best stories in the book when the guy knocks on your door and thinks that it has to be fed.
I buy this, and it's a anthropomorphic, zoomorphic actually figure. It is made of feces and earth, and bones are put in the anus of it, and it's a deity in certain tribes in West Africa. It's called a boli, B-O-L-I, and everybody should go and look them up. And they're extraordinary. And if you X-ray them, you see all of these important parts of the tribe that are buried inside them. And I started buying them when I could find them in the flea market and bringing them home. And one day, I hear a knock on the door at it's like 1 a.m. And suddenly, it's my friend Ibrahim who sold this to me. And he said, look, Michael, I sold this to you. I'm from Mali. I appreciate you buying it from me. He said, actually, I'm Islamic. I'm Muslim. But if I had one of those damn things in my apartment, I would be feeding it regularly. And I said, what does that involve? And he said, well, you can either slaughter a goat or a chicken. And even that at 12 o'clock in the evening seemed a little bizarre. And I said, is there any alternative to that? And he said, well, yes, you can have women who are menstruating come squat over the animal and allow their menstrual blood to feed the boli, and the boli will be happy. So I called up Sheila, who, as you know, engages in exotic travel, and she was in the middle of Uzbekistan or someplace. And I said, Sheila, I've just been told by Ibrahim. And she said, Michael, do you really want to assemble a group of menstruating women in your apartment at 1 a.m? So I decided, no, probably not. I called up the Brooklyn Museum the next day, and I offered to donate the boli to them, which I did. So I found a less hungry one, smaller, less hungry one. That's it.
Do we think that the museum feeds these deities?
It's a good question. Maybe the Brooklyn Museum does. They're very respectful. They've got a great collection.
They're pretty interesting, forward-thinking folks.
Yes, they are.
It's funny because one of the things that story got to me is about how everything, whether we're talking about a Jackson Pollock painting or a poem or a book, has the meaning we imbue it with. And so this notion of feeding a statue in a strange way it could be conceived as extremely important. The way at a Catholic mass, every mass you go to, you basically are doing a little play where you pretend you're at the crucifix and Jesus says to you, here's my body, here's my blood, take, eat. This is, and that we're all ingesting the divine, and we're all witness to this beauty and this crucifixion, and that we're reminded all the time. And the reason to remind yourself is to keep it in the front part of your consciousness, because we all go back to sleep so quickly with our addictions and our, it's so hard to stay awake. And so feeding a deity in a way makes a lot of sense to me.
Yes, I think that I think that they're very threatening to us because it breaks down the barrier between humans and objects. And the whole dichotomy between hoarding and collecting is all about shutting down that distinction. Unless you keep your objects in a case with a little label on it and a lock, those objects are going to overwhelm you. They're going to take over your life, and you're going to be a hoarder, right? You are going to be confined to that category.
But isn't it strange? It seems almost Shakespearean to me that this pandemic would happen in the year that we've kissed the god of money. If you told me back in the 80s that the guy who's putting his name in gold letters over Atlantic City and all over the city was someday going to be in charge of the whole country, I would have laughed. My grandfather, childhood depression, was living in Swenson, Texas, heard FDR on a little radio about Pearl Harbor, asking people to recruit, drives from Swenson to Austin, recruits, flies jet, bombers over Germany, does the whole thing. And late in his life, I guess he died about 10 years ago. And I remember him asking me, he was very aware that in his lifetime, when he was a kid, this country's primary resource was agriculture. Our primary export was agriculture. And now our primary export is entertainment. He said, it's this very strange switch to have happened in one lifetime. And he was talking about how when he was a kid, the nation's identity was a democracy, that we were the great democratic experiment. And he grew up, a fervent lover of FDR, right? And he's like, and now our identity, people say they call us capitalists. We call ourselves capitalists. In this pride in money, in worshiping of something utterly superficial. I think what moves you about that statue behind you is that there's actually things inside of it. It's actually a thing of substance.
Yes.
It looks like mud, and is gold, as opposed to things that look gold and are mud. Right? And I find it really strange. There's something very beautiful about the way you manage to you see very deeply into these people that you met. And the book is written with so much love. And even I, as a reader, I place myself at that flea market and I think about the ways that I would have judged those people immediately, in the way that I wouldn't have seen beyond them, in the way that you take me. The way it ends is so exquisite. This guy who's been the guardian, he's the guardian almost like a sphinx or something. It's so beautiful. And then you see into his little world. It's very profound, Michael.
Thank you. The relationship that people have to their objects, that the vendors have to their objects, is unlike what most people have to their objects. Certainly the rest of the world who's seeing them in a monetary way, these people have very personal relationships with what they have assembled over the years, whether it's a $5 little toy or it's something more expensive. And it is that boundary between objects and humans and the affection that runs between them that the book addresses in no small way, and that I have been affected and that I've been affected by. So I'm constantly bringing home objects. I did so today that are personal to me because of their connection to an ecosystem that I've been part of, which is other vendors, other objects, and a certain point in my life. Just as you and I have that personal relationship, the atmosphere of the Chelsea Hotel, a bottle of bourbon, the stories we told, and those are the kind of things, those are the connections that are so deeply affecting to people.
And I think everybody, I mean, you're writing about this flea market thing, but everybody has something usually where they've taken an object and imbued it. Like there's a magic every now and then when you're an actor, right? You're doing a play and you get some weird chainmail armor, right? That's been drug out of the basement of Lincoln Center that was traded. And there in it, is.
And what was it for you? Was
Jeremy Irons' Christopher Plummer's name, like whatever. You see some other actor, some actor you haven't heard of, some actor, and you see their name stitched in with their character. You see, I saw Sean Connery, Hotspur, and you're like, he wore this, and it's filled with so much magic, or you get, because there's only a limited amount of these Shakespearean swords. Well, maybe this is a sword Pacino wielded, and it's their
and that's what
a very beautiful thing
do in the book. They bring that magic through stories, through their affection for these objects, to the objects, and it transfers to you through that association. It's really extraordinary. Was there a particular object
at one point?
No, go ahead.
Gosh, well, at one point in the book, you called it kind of a form of theater, and I think it's what I was acting. It's everybody. It's don't you see it with your kids? You can say, "Hey, this is the dress Mommy wore when we were on our way to the hospital when you were born." Right. And it kind of, it makes sense out of our lives for a moment. And that's the thing we're all trying to do is, whether it's old movie posters, movies have value, or whether it's like connection to African art that I want, we want connection to that we feel disconnected from, or whether it's Europe, or whether it's some Japanese poem that's not signed. We can get, it's the narrative that we put to it that helps us. I mean, my thing is, because I think uncertainty is so much a part of an actor's life. I never know what my next job's going to be. I never know where. I've had years, where I've made a good living, and I've had years, where I lost money year after year after year. And I don't know what's coming ahead. I asked my son, when he was about 15, I said, "You think you're going to want to be an actor?" And he said, "No way." I said, "Why not?" He said, "I want a job that if I get better at it, I get paid more money." It's like, it's like some of the people that aren't even good at your job get paid more money than people who aren't good at it. It doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, that's the arts, pal. But for me, I love, like, it's embarrassing, but like playbills and posters from plays, ads from a movie, things that give my life continuity, where I can go, okay, that happened. That movie came out. I worked hard on that, and that helped me to do that. And I can, and my kids will make fun of me and they'll say, oh, it's like Dad's, I got in the basement, all these different posters and stuff like I've been going through, and they call it the Hall of Ego, and I'm like, it is kind of the Hall of Ego. But for me, I don't look at it like it's important to anyone else. It helps me draw a connection to the boy I was, and to the young man I was, or the divorcee that I was, or the older man that I am now, or like it helps me thread my life. And because I go job to job to job, I like to see the connection between the jobs.
I couldn't agree with you more, and it's one of the reasons why I address this in the book. I object so much to the word hoarder, right? Don't call someone a hoarder unless you have sat down with them and gone through everything that they've collected, and you've talked to them about this. Why did you collect this? When did you collect this? Who gave it to you? What was the social circumstance, emotional circumstance in which that object attached to you? And if you do that, if you're careful and you listen to people talk about their objects in the flea market, and I do that to some extent in the book, not enough, you hear remarkable things about the objects, about these people's lives, about the world. And that's part of the magic of the flea market for me.
And about what they care about.
Yes.
What they love.
Right.
I mean, let me ask you this. What's interesting to me is that when I was first going to that market from your book, it sounds like it was really the heyday. Where is that whole world now? Is it online?
Some of it is online, but there is a Brooklyn flea market. The people who run one of the Brooklyn flea markets are taking over the 25th Street flea market in Chelsea. So when the current crisis abates, that flea market will reopen. So a lot of the people I write about in the book will be back in that flea market on 25th Street. Go visit them and talk to them. My friend David Killen, I write a lot about David, who was in the flea market, now has this wonderful auction house on 25th Street. He's still open, right? So it's not completely online. There are still flea markets in New York, not far from you in Brooklyn. And the rest of the country has thousands of flea markets. There's something that you just can't get on. It's the Art Students League. We're doing wonderful things with remote learning. Our instructors are teaching people how to paint, how to draw, how to sculpt in what is essentially remote studios that we've created. And yet there's nothing like being in those ancient, beautiful studios at the Art Students League with other artists. So it's a different experience, different.
But I do think, Michael, I think that this generation, I'm as hard as this time is, I'm really excited for them. My son is graduating this year from high school, class of 2020, and whether it's college, everybody's going to look back on 2020 as a different year. And I have a feeling that this generation of young people might be very substantive thinkers, and might carry with them a sense of gratitude that our generation just, I never knew to be grateful that the act of performing a play was something that I should be grateful for.
Right.
That the right to assemble, the right to congregate, the right that people would be willing to risk their lives and sit down elbow to elbow with other people to listen to a story that I'm telling. I never even knew to be grateful for that. I'll never not be grateful for that again. Do you know? Never. I never knew to be grateful for the NBA. I used to watch. I love sports, watching sports is like the great Xanax and on the TV for me. It makes me not care about my own life for a brief period of time. I find it so relaxing.
I think the generation of our children will be a much more profound generation, Nikolaya, Maya, Levon, for going through this. It's terribly difficult for them now, but they are going to be important thinkers in ways that we were not. We were kind of witty and sardonic.
And ironic,
Yeah, but
irony was valued a great deal, yeah.
Exactly, but not profound.
I'm really excited for them. And, we've left them a real shit show with the planet,
Oh, yes.
I mean, this hopefully is going to start to, this idea. When I was a kid, people would talk about interconnectedness, sounded like kind of some kind of airy fairy new age idea. I remember once Thich Nhat Hanh had this, this Buddhist monk. He was talking about Shakespeare says, the question is not to be or not to be. The question is to interbe. And and so it always seemed like kind of a new age idea. And I think now our absolute interconnectivity is going to be really obvious to this generation. Yeah. And they might be able to do something to help the planet.
Right.
So I'm optimistic about that.
The bird that Sheila created that Maya was hugging, this is the maquette done at the Art Studios. Yeah. But, it's the brilliance of Sheila that she was able to focus on this one robin and to say, don't take this for granted. This is something important. This is a symbol of what we should be committed to and what we are currently destroying. And this bird is suddenly, in Wisconsin, in Florida, people are commissioning this bird. So I think there's a newfound, perhaps too late, respect for these parts of our environment that we've ignored, sadly.
Well, what's the future? What's it like to publish a book right now where you can't do a book tour? And I mean, I feel for you. Like, I wish we were doing this Q&A at a Barnes & Noble on 23rd Street, right? I mean, how are you doing it?
This way, virtually. I did an interview with Martha Stewart. I've done interviews and with others, and the people at W.W. Norton, Matt Violin, my editor, Lauren, others are spectacular. I mean, they've really found new ways of publishing books in this environment, and I love what they're doing. And the book has received tremendous amount of attention. I think it's number one on the new book list.
I'm so impressed with your reviews, and I'm so impressed. One thing I really, it's funny. Like Ryan, my wife, she was very like, are you still there? Did we lose you?
Me? No.
Oh, good. Somehow your picture went.
You look like a Baroque painting, by the way. The color in your.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Is that good?
Oh, yeah, fantastic. The Art Students
one of the
League
things
affected me. Yeah.
One of the things that I was most curious about, you mentioned the child getting lost in the combine, that comes up a couple times in the book. Wasn't that an idea that you'd had for a whole other book?
Yes, exactly. And that came out of the theme of the book of the accidental and how you deal with the accidental. And it was a fellow out in Virginia who ended up running over a pack of very valuable dogs. And there was just this excitement, this thrill, this lust to blame him. And it was really an accident. And again, the accidental, that notion and uncertainty are something that we have a lot of difficulty processing. And we can't accept that something is an accident, that if horrible things happen, they must have some cause. There must be some villain behind it. And I reject.
And the same is true. I reject it too, and I think your book gets at that. It's very interesting. It's like what we're saying is people think that if you're rummaging through old things and you've defined a de Kooning painting, then your time is worthwhile. If you rummage through things and you don't find, it's like, well, wait a second, guys. What is the value of our time spent? You know, I mean, I think one of the hardest things, you know me well enough to know that I'm just a restless person. And I'm an extremely social person. And so this has been really hard for me, you know, like just not getting to see people, not getting to act, not getting to be engaged in the things that I'm used to. I keep thinking this stupid mantra, you know, which is that it's just so dumb probably, but it helps me. Every morning I decided to get through this thing. I have a coffee. I help my kids get onto their Zoom school. I have a coffee and I do a little watercolor, right? And I have this little collection of watercolor notebooks. And the front of it is I just wrote a human being, you know, and I just stare at that word over that, you know, those three words. And I know that somewhere it's not a human doing, you know, somewhere in the riddle of us being alive is learning how to be and how to be with each other. And that it's, we like I criticize the movie industry for turning into a competition, but we do it with every aspect of our life. And so I will, before this whole thing has to end, I want to tell you that I'm grateful to these people for setting this up, that I got to be with you, and that people paid us the respect of their time. I know how valuable their time is. Anybody who joined us, I'm so grateful to you guys for listening. It's so much fun to get to talk to Michael.
You know, Ethan, my friend, you have to do something with that idea and watercolors for the league. Will you do something with us?
All right.
And we'll send it out.
I will. I'd love to. I would love to show you. I'm about to run out of battery. We've been talking so long.
We have a history of great watercolorists who are at the league. I mean, absolutely.
Well, I'd love to show them. It's been a wild thing to study your own meditation. I try not to I never have a plan. And I have this beautiful old book, and I just open it up every morning and I do it until I feel like I've finished. And it's been a really healing thing, and it's been really interesting to watch the ebb and flow of you know, from feeling very ecstatic about the opportunity to get off the treadmill, and to feeling worried about other people, to feeling depressed about myself, to being, you know, all the different ebbs and flows with this whole thing. But yeah, when this is over and we can come in, let me come in and we'll talk watercolors, and I can get a tutorial.
Why did you pick watercolor, by the way, as opposed to oil paint or pencil or any of the other mediums?
I've always done it. You know, it's a very useful travel tool. Right. You know, with me, when I first, right after Dead Poets Society, got this job, it was Jack London's White Fang. And, you know, I got sent to Alaska for 7 months. And I mailed away for some watercolors. And I've always, it's a thing to do, to be creative on sets that doesn't take, you're not that angry when somebody says, "Hey, Ethan, we need you on set." Yeah. You know,
I know Sheila, when she
our time is up,
does travel books, but I think Sheila's travel books, which are extraordinary, like 70 travel books, beautiful. But I think she uses oil paints or acrylics, because they.
Well, I'm sure that's what the pros do, Michael. That's what the pros do. Yeah.
But I'm told at the art studio,
I think our time is
really difficult. It's hard to work with. It seems simple.
I love it. Will you tell Sheila and Nikolai that I love them, and that everyone in the world should read The Golden Flea? I thought it sounded, when Michael told me he wrote a book about flea markets, I thought he was nuts. And it's so good. And it's really worth your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ethan. Thank you, Michael. Buy The Golden Flea. It sounds riveting and such great stories. Thanks you all for joining us.
It definitely is.
Thank you. Thank you for promoting The Golden Flea. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.